Or it's okay. Good morning, dearest friends. The 9th of Shvat. And I just hit something I didn't mean to. 9th of Shvat and January 11th. It's 2022. Tafshin Pei Beis. You hear my sound? The sound is working? Okay. We're studying the entire Talmud, one page, one line at a time. We are presently in the Masechet Shabbos, chapter 11 of Shabbos. And we are on Sadik Zayin Amud Beis. That's 97b. We're moving in, we're inching in on 100. That's a big milestone. And we're talking about Zorek, throwing. And yesterday we spent the bulk of our discussion reading a Mishnah or a line in the Mishnah, a debate in the Mishnah about throwing from one private domain to the other. And there was a machlokes. Rabbi Akiva says, Chayiv, you are liable for, this is a malacha for throwing an item from one private domain to the other private domain via a public domain. And the Chachamim say Potter. And the Gemara's goal was to figure out what exactly the scenarios were. Are you always Potter? Are you always exempt according to the Chachamim? Is there a scenario where causing an item to move from a private domain through a public domain and back into a private domain, you may yet be chayiv? And so we had three different takes on the Mishnah. And as I said, it was a very stereotypical kind of Gemara. I don't even start, but where we kind of have one text, and we realize that although the text seems to be open and shut, there's really many possibilities and three different takes on the text. And that's just in the Gemara. Forget about the Rishonim. And so option A was that the whole machloket was under 10 tfachim. That's where Rabbi Akiva says you're chayiv and the Chacham say you're pater. And the crux of the issue, this was the teaching of Rav Hamnuna, if I'm not mistaken. If I got it wrong, you'll correct me. Which is that you're only klutek mishahuncha when you're in the airspace of the public domain. So then when you're in the air, it's as if you're on the ground. I think we might say this is Professor Stern's interpretation of the Gemara. And the Chachamim say even under such a scenario, one is exempt because this is not considered putting it down. Option B is the Chachamim always say you're exempt, no matter how high or low the item you throw is. And Rabbi Akiva would always say that one is chayiv, no matter how high it is, even though we have the problem that you're not in the airspace above 10 tefachim is not considered public domain. So we said, well, we learned that from Moshe, the way when they would pass the beams in the Mishkan, it would be above 10 tefachim, and yet it is considered that it was being moved through a public domain. And again, in the scholarship of the Rishonim, we could show and certainly the Achronim, we could dig a little deeper to understand why you might say that. But that is the second interpretation of the Mishnah. The third take was the most nuanced, that up to 3 tvachim. So if you throw something really, really low and close to the ground, up to 3 tvachim is considered it's on the ground, and everyone agrees you're a chayiv. Above 10 tvachim, everybody agrees that one is exempt, and from 3 to 10 tvachim, that's where there's a debate. Rabbi Akiva says chayiv, Chacham say pater. And this third interpretation is the most nuanced. It's also the most inclusive because it allows every opinion of the Mishnah to consider each scenario. And really everybody agrees for the most part, with the exception of the 7 tefachim between 3 and 10. That was yesterday's Gemara in a nutshell. Obviously there's more. We talked about what if you own both private domains? Does that make a difference? But that was the crux of yesterday's Gemara. Today's Gemara, we will continue on the question, on the issue of lavud 3 tefachim. So at the very end of yesterday's Gemara, we started mentioning that the public domain is public. But if something rests within 3 tefachim, everybody agrees that it's considered in the public domain. And so the Gemara wants to understand why. And primarily this teaching is taught in the context of a mound or an unsmooth surface. And we talked a little bit about the challenge of smoothing out entirely, to have the ground entirely smooth. So a rock, a bump, a lump, an imperfection, that's all considered part of the public domain. But the principle of lava, the principle that 3 tvachim is as if it's non-existent, it's flush with the ground, has great and varied halachic applications, and that's where our Gemara is heading today. So again, if you've ever heard of the phrase lavud, and I'll tell you, it becomes very relevant in the laws of Sukkah, and it's actually going to be quoted in our Gemara. The principle of lavud also is relevant to Shabbos, to what it constitutes a mechitza, a barrier, and we'll see. So anyways, that is where we're holding. Today, we are learning in dedication for the good health and well-being of all the dear members of our Chabura and their households. We mentioned a refuah shlema for Yaakov ben Chana, and we're going to mention, we're going to mention Leah bas Rita, Malka bas Rivka, Chaim Baruch Eliezer ben Rusa Esther, Ludmila ben Jada Malka, Esther Malka bas Reb Yoel, and everyone else that is in need of a refuah shlema. We should have an abundance of good news, healthy news, and happy news. And now I think we have spent ample time in the preamble and the intro. Let's share the screen and dive into the Talmud itself. Here we go. Hold on, we're here. Well, I should point out, we're going to go to lavud, but I should just point out the last discussion was about two uneven balconies, and if you unintentionally threw something and it landed in the public domain, that's not the core problem. A little bit more of a problem is that you might come to carry it. Again, I just want to make sure we didn't pass over that. That was the last time. Now we're on to lavud. Amar lei Rav Chisda le Rav Hamnuna. This is an important subject in the Talmud, in halachic scholarship. It's a good principle to have in our back pocket. Amar le Rav Chisda Rav Hamnuna. By the way, I should say it's possible when we conclude this discussion about lavud, maybe, if time allows, maybe we'll go back here and just look at some of the commentaries to gain some more insight in the halachic or in the Shulchan Aruch about throwing from higher to lower and that kind of thing. We talked about basketball and football and baseball yesterday too, if you recall. So if you weren't here yesterday, yeah, we talked about all the different sports and the halachic implications. Amar le Rav Chisda Rav Hamnuna. Rav Chisda says to Rav Hamnuna, Amri le Rav Hamnuna Rav Chisda. There's a version that has it reversed. Mina ha milsa da Amar Rabbana. What is the premise of what the rabbis say? What do they say? Kol pachais mishalosh kilavud dami. Any time that you have less than 3 tfachim, kilavud dami, it's as if it's attached. We discount that in that space. There's an invisible barrier, and that space is non-existent in the eyes of Jewish law. Might we call this a legal fiction, or is that a misuse of that phrase? Anyone here? Could we call that a legal fiction? In the view of halakha, in the view of the law, there is a barrier, or it is flush, even though in reality it is not. All right. But how do I know? What is the premise? What is the basis? Why do we say pachas mishalosh kilavu dami? Rashi.
By the way,
yes.
As an aside, in Hebrew today, in everyday language, etz lavud is plywood.
Hold on, eitz
lavud.
Lavud. Does it mean compressed? Lavud means compressed, right?
Yeah, it's plywood.
But I'm saying in modern Hebrew, I think the word lavud would be like.
Well, it's not really.
Would that be particle board actually rather than plywood?
What?
Compressed would be particle board as opposed to layers. Plywood is layers
Right.
of wood.
But if but it's colloquially it's called dict, or but plywood, etz lavud would be plywood.
Here, so I just want to show you something funny. Can you see my screen? I entered into Google eitz lavud, and so here, if you see where my cursor is, that's I think what eitz lavud is, as the professor is telling us. But the word lavud is so utterly part of the
I'm
conversation.
not a professor. Don't make me a professor.
I'm sorry, doctor. I'm sorry. I'm first of all, professor. I'm sure the professor would agree. Professor is a compliment, but.
Yeah, exactly. It's a compliment, but it's an undeserved compliment.
Okay, I beg your pardon. So anyways, here we have, as the doctor says, as Rabbi Nachum says, this is eitz lavud. So Mark, I think you're right. I don't know if it's it is plywood.
And that's
I was
plywood, yeah.
thinking plywood,
I'm trying to think
but
of what I got
probably
left for
in
It's Malay, which I think is supposed to be solid wood as opposed to the
I think compressed board would be a better description.
so that's
I can't tell if I
So-
see the grain or not on that one.
but suffice it to say, it is interesting because even Google has no choice. But when you type in the word lavud, the majority of the results are going to end up being something to do with a sukkah, because the word lavud is so utterly associated with the halachic conversation of here. You see, translate plywood to. One more thing, I think this is the Jastro that we're quoting. Lavud, literally, the word is compact or solid, but what it means is that we I don't want to use the imaginary, although I guess that's the right word. We envision as if that space is non-existent. We compact, we schlep together between the two spaces. Let's read actually the dictionary entry. This is not, wherever there is a gap of less than 3 handbreadths, the parts so separated are considered as solid. And so that actually helps us understand why eitz lavud would mean compressed wood. And in the halachic concept that we're talking about is also lavud. For example, a mat suspended vertically. We're going to see this in the Gemara in a moment. Hence lavud. Oh, you see, now I feel vindicated. Hence lavud, the legal fiction of considering separated parts as united, if the gap is less than 3 handbreadths. So there we have it. From the Jastro, lavud, joined, combined. So basically, we're combining two sides, which are in reality apart. But now let's zoom back to our discussion. Our discussions at this point on Shabbos in item lands within 3 tvachim, it's considered on the ground. Why? The reshus she'eno gevoha gimel batal eitzel reshus rab. Any space that is any bump, any mound, any elevation that's only 3 tvachim doesn't get to be considered its own domain. It would probably be a makom p'tor, or if it had the right size, or a Rishos HaYachid, or a Carmelis. But 3 tvachim, it's considered flush even if it isn't. And the Gemara wants to know, what is this principle of 3 tvachim space being flush with what's below it? The Rishos She'en Gevay Gimel Batal Eitz Rishos Sarah. Amar Lei. So here he gives an answer that's grounded very much in logic. Lefi she'yafshar lo Rishos Rabim. It is absolutely impossible to smooth out the ground of the floor of the outside of the Rishus Rabim with a plane and a level, or to make it level with a plane. Rashi, Amar Lei Savarahi. It makes a lot of sense. I know we read this yesterday, but it's impossible to smooth out the ground from all of the clumps of earth and clods of earth, to be smooth as if it was smooth with a plane. And these are tools that we actually discussed a little while ago, if you recall. We actually used Google to tell us what a plane was. There was a modern plane and an ancient plane, but the principle is the same. It has a razor of sorts, and it allows you to create a surface that's entirely smooth. And the ability to do so in a public domain is non-existent, certainly in the time of the Gemara. Today, I think we have the greater ability with our heavy equipment, but suffice it to say, there's not an expectation that a public domain is going to be entirely smooth, and so therefore, small elevations is considered part of the public domain. All right. So the Gemara. So go ahead.
About 9 inches. That's quite a variance.
9 inches, 10 inches.
Yeah, 9-10 inches. Yeah, it's
It is, but it is and it isn't. If you think about how space how ground is usually not so smooth, and certainly,
for a paved surface, it would be very for
that's what I was
non-paved.
going to say. Certainly, in a time where most things weren't paved, think about if you went to any of the old cities and there was even cobblestone, let alone unpaved surfaces, and there's quite a variation. Certainly over the wide expanse of space, you're going to have ups and downs, and that is That is the deal. And so therefore, Savara, according to logic would indicate that 3 tvachim variation on the elevation of the ground in a public domain should be inconsequential, and halachically it is inconsequential. Ihachi, the Gemara says, shloisha nami. So what is exactly the cutoff point, says the Gemara? Why is the cutoff point 3 tvachim? Even saying that 3 tvachim should also really, in other words, I think that's the question. Why do you cut off at 3 tvachim? Irregularity, bumps and lumps could exist even beyond. In other words, Mark, 10 inches or 11 inches. What's the real distinction between 10 inches and 11 inches? What?
Somewhere between 9. You think a tefach is 3 to 3.5 inches. So
Right. Okay. So 9 and so it's anywhere between 9 and 11.
yeah, that's interesting because in a sukkah, if it's less than 10 tvachim, it's a gap. It's considered not a gap.
Correct. And we're heading there in a moment. We're heading there in a moment because that is the primary place where lavud has relevance in day-to-day halacha. It also has relevance in the laws of Eruvin. Eli, you've come across lavud at all in your study of Masechet Eruvin? Yes, you have. Okay. Eli, in a very beginner terminology, have we gotten it right so far?
Yes, it's perfect. Listen,
Okay.
I'm not 100% in it. I'm not 100% in Eruvin and everything. It's very difficult, very hard. But we're good. We're doing good.
Ali, this is going to end up. You'll end up being able to take some of what we discussed and apply it back in data, and it'll be helpful too.
Amen.
So the question is, what's 3? Why is 3 the cutoff? I'm hoping some other commentaries give us some. All right, we're gonna have to do this the real way with our own brains. So again, why is 3 the cutoff? Let it be 4 tvachim or 3.5 tvachim.
it's only about 3.
I'll explain to the point. I think if there is a halachic, let's say there's a tradition from Moshe or there's a verse, so then the Gemara is very comfortable deferring to it an authority of a pasuk, the authority of a tradition. But in the absence of such a tradition, it needs to make sense. And whenever you have an arbitrary number, you'll ask, go a little more, go a little less. What's this 3? And so really we're probing for a deeper or more authoritative source to the assertion that 3 tvachim or under 3 tvachim, yes, 3 tvachim, no. Ground ultimately is irregular in unpaved areas beyond 3 tvachim. And therefore the Gemara is probing for something more. Visu, there is a greater challenge to this, to the assertion that it just has to do with the lack of smoothness of the ground. Hadetanan, there's a Mishnah. And again, here's just our opening salvo introducing Sukkah and Lavud. Hamashalshel difanot milamayla lamata. If a person extends down, Rashi explains, in a woven manner. Maschil la'arog dofnei sukkah. So today, I don't know if you noticed, in Florida, there was a lot of lattice work. And there's a reason for it. The reason being that in Florida, we like the air to go through. In places like Montreal, I have a feeling we'd rather keep some of the wind and the cold out. But imagine that you're having some kind of woven walls. Matril erog dofnei asukah ba'erev klape mala u'mishalshel uva klape mata. So you start on the top of the sukkah and you string it down, and you weave down your sukkah. Milamala lamata imhem givohim. If they end up givohim in haaretz shlosha tvachim, if they end up dangling and not reaching all the way to the ground, and they end up being more than 3 tvachim from the floor, pisula. This is an unkosher sukkah. Higher than 3 is a problem. So now he says, so if that's the case, then exactly 3 tvachim should be kosher. What did we say over here? So we're asking a question, is it up to 3 or is it including 3? Here it sounds like up to 3. But here we have a Mishnah which clearly says less than 3. So basically 3 is, in other words, does the law, does the magic of lavud, does the fiction, does the legal principle of lavud up to 3 or including 3? And that is the question we're asking here. Again, if it's, and there's a Mishnah which seems to indicate that when the walls come low, 3 tvachim, over 3 tvachim, if the gap that's larger than 3 tvachim is a problem, 3 tvachim is good. And if that's the case in the public domain, 3 tvachim should also be an acceptable amount of space. So it's possible that.
What happens if it's 3 tvachim? Specific, and
it's kosher. You have your tape measure. If you have your halachic tape measure or your halachic app on your phone and you measure it, because today you can. If it's 3 tvachim, it's okay. It's loved. If it's more than 3 tvachim, then you've got a problem.
Well, no, but it says here if it's less than 3 tvachim, it's okay. It doesn't say 3. It says less than 3 tvachim. My question is, what happens if it's exactly 3 tvachim? The instructions are either more than 3 tvachim or less than 3 tvachim. What happens?
It's possible that I'm misexplaining this. Let's take a look at Rashi and then let's revisit it. If I'm saying it wrong, I'll correct myself in a second. Im givoyim in haaretz gimel tvachim sula hapachod begimel kshira. Damrin lavod k'misha nichfaf aleim v'nishma l'mata hachalav tamad l'tlaket. Okay, I stand corrected. I'm sorry. I made a chalent that isn't warranted. The way Rashi explains this Gemara, and I'm going to defer to Rashi. I'm sorry, I have to confuse you. Forget all of the intricate differences between 3 and less than 3 and more than 3. Try to forget that. All we're saying is that the principle of 3 is applied, that's the way Rashi explains it, to a scenario of the walls of a sukkah, where the issue of a plane and flatness is totally irrelevant. Again, I want to read you this Rashi. Im givohot min haaretz gimel tvachim sula pachim begimel kshera da'amrin alavud kimisha nichfaf aleim v'nishlemu ad lamata hachalav tamat lakatu nearly done. Yeah. So basically, if I understand this Gemara correctly, here the issue is that a sukkah. Hold on one second. Give me one second. I'm sorry.
Rabbi, I think it might be simpler than what we're doing. I think they're trying to find a minimum, and here they found a source where this is a minimum and finish.
I know, but that's what I was trying to say, but that's not the case. Basically, the principle that we're used over here of the public domain being smooth would not be a good reason to discount a gap of up to 3 tvachim. And so basically what the Gemara is trying to do is the Gemara is pushing for a better, or it's not really the Gemara, it's Rav Hamnuna or Rav Chisda are pushing for a better reason for the principle of lavut that is more inclusive of all the different scenarios where halacha says that up to 3 tvachim is considered compressed. It's considered connected. And so the principle that he said, Suvara, would work in the public domain. It gets more complicated when it comes to sukkah, because there's no reason to say that the ground is lumpy. We're looking at a space, we're looking at a gap. In reality, the gap exists. And the Gemara is probing for a more general principle of why lavud works. And so the Gemara says, Hasam Haino Taima. No, I'll explain to you. By sukkah, you know why 3 tvachim works? More than 3 tvachim, or up to 3 tvachim, is considered that there is no gap. More than 3 tvachim is considered a gap. Mishum dahavala mechitza shagadim boikim. A good wall is a wall that keeps undesirable elements out. For example, who do you want to keep out of your sukkah? Well, critters such as gedim, goats, Rashi. A wall that has a breach of 3 tvachim or more cannot keep out goats. Upachot, Rashi says, mishlosha leka b'kiyat gedim. But if the hole is less than 3, then it does do a good job keeping stuff out. And a wall is meant to keep certain elements out. A wall that cannot keep things out is not a wall. And so more than 3 tvachim gap, says the Gemara, that's not a good wall. And so what we've done at this point is where the Gemara is trying to, it seems like we are still in denial that there is a broad principle of lavud, and we think that every instance there's a separate reason. The public domain is not entirely smooth. So if something lands within 3 tvachim or lands on a mountain that's 3 tvachim, it's considered part of the public domain. And when it comes to sukkah, a gap of 3 tvachim makes it a not good wall, but less than 3 tvachim it's as good as a boundary. So the Gemara says, I might be inclined to accept this, but we can't. Teinach lemata. This would work to explain why lavud works to block from the bottom if it's up to 3 tvachim. Lamaila ma'ika lameimar. Why? Rashi lamaila hecha damrin on lavud lamaila bekama duchtin goy makifin. Why do you say that on the top there's also the occasional principle of lavud of 3 tvachim? Ostensively, the top part of the sukkah, the top walls, we're not dealing with goats. So why are we using the same principle of 3 tvachim? And here's the punchline. And so even if you're confused, or it's possible that I confused you a little bit, and I apologize for that. Here's the punchline. Elokol pachos mishlosha, so long as a gap, a space, is under 3 tvachim, kilavud dami. There is an overarching principle. Kol pachos mishlosha kilavud dami. How do we know this? Hilchita gimirila. This is another teaching that is mimoshe misinai. This is not necessarily the specific logic of a specific situation, but there is a halachic fact in Jewish tradition, going back in the oral tradition, mimoshe misinai, that a gap of less than 3 tvachim or an elevation of less than 3 tvachim is considered as if it's non-existent. The hole is non-existent. The bump is non-existent. This is a general rule of Jewish law. Let's read Rabbi Steinsaltz. No, he just says it's a halacha. It's transmitted to Moshe from Sinai. This is a long-standing, powerful, and absolute Jewish principle within the Jewish tradition. Take it or leave it. Well, you can't leave it. You have to take it, but that's the reason. So we were trying to come up with a svara. We were trying to come up with a rational, a rationale behind the principle. This is not to say that there is no rationale behind it, but the force, the power, the authority that comes from is not the power of reason. It's the power of halacha, the Moshe Misinai.
So, Rabbi, that slugs up the 3 tvachim itself because it has to be less. So 3 is not less. 3 itself.
Up to 3, not including 3. So 2 point. Mark, you read it? What were you saying?
2.999, whatever,
2.99. Is it 2.9 or do we say 2.4? But anyways, just under.
Whatever.
Just
have to be
under.
less than than 3 tvachim, Let's see.
Right. So anyways, 2.9 or whatever. Just under fraction.
If you eat a kazayas, is it exactly kazayas? It has to be a little over kazayas, You get kazayas,
Yep.
but if you're up to a kazayas, you're not high whatever for whatever whatever it is with the kazayas.
Yep. And so, again, this is not to say that it is irrational or not rational, but the authority of this principle is halacha l'Moshe Misinai, a tradition that comes with the power of the oral tradition back to Moshe himself. And the premise, the Jewish belief, the principle of Jewish tradition is that there are different halachot that come from varying authority. You have things that are explicit in the pasuk. You have things that the pasuk, which is understood and explained with the oral tradition, but you also, which is the power of also the tradition that dates back to Moshe Sinai. But there are also on occasion unwritten principles that are fundamental to the basics of Judaism that also date back halacha Moshe Sinai. What I want to do, but we're going to go further. We're not done yet. I want to zoom back.
Rabbi,
yes, go ahead.
Not to go off again on the tangent, how accurate were measuring tools in those days? I mean, today for a kilogram somewhere in the world under an atomic glass is an actual kilogram, etc., etc. I'm just wondering.
It's a question that's a reoccurring question. The reality is, it seems like there was a local precise concept but there was not a universal measurement. The precision may have been based on a person's own measurements or other factors. It doesn't seem like there was a universal measure. And that explains why there's so much debate today in our attempt to create a universal amount based on our other universal, measures based on the metric system or whatever. Once upon a time, it seems like there was a degree of art to the science. It was precise, but it was based on fluctuating principles, maybe a local town standard or the individual's capacity to measure. So much so, the Gemara even has a debate. What were the dimensions of the tfachim what were the dimensions of the amot in the Beis Hamikdash? We know how many amot, but we don't know how big the amot were. So because there was a degree of variability that does not exist today. And that explains why you might have varying perspectives.
I think inches, 24 inches is typical with
Yeah, we've discussed this before, so I don't want to totally reopen it. But it's a good question, and it's something that we have to keep in mind. And right now I'm looking for something very specific, which I'm not finding. So. All right, this is not exactly what I was looking for, but let's take a look. This is the Rambam, Mishnah Torah, who is encapsulating the very issue that we're discussing here in our Mishnah. And as you recall, we have three different opinions to understand the machloket of Rabbi Kiva and Chachamim. Let's see how the Rambam ultimately presents this halakha, and then we're going to go into some additional discussions. Until now, we've talked about throwing from a private domain to a public domain from a private domain to a private domain via a public domain. What if the situation is reversed? What if there is a little lot? Today it happens, developers are buying out large areas and one person holds out. So what happens if you have a big public square with smack in the middle, you have, Sally Macbeth's home, which she doesn't sell. And so they develop all around, and you want to throw something from one public domain to the other public domain, and it passes through a private domain. So before we do that, let's take a look at the Rambam. Hazorek mirshut hayachid l'reshut hayachid. You throw something from one private domain to another private domain. Urishus harabim, the M sign running between the two is a public domain. Afalpi sha'avar hachefetz be'avir rishus harabim. Although the item has passed through the airspace of the public domain, one is exempt. So certainly this sounds like the Rambam, before we go into the specifics, is taking the position of the Chachamim, which is not surprising. This is so long as it is above 3 tfachim. It sounds like we're taking the third presentation of the Mishnah in the opinion of the Chachamim. But if you manage to throw, and listen, there's certain, I'm not a pitcher and baseball is not my thing. What would we call a kind of pitch that goes really low and then zoops up? A slider?
Sinker.
A sinker? No, but a sinker is the reverse. A sinker is high and then drops low. But what if it goes low and then comes up? Is there such a pitch? I'm sorry to display my amaratus in baseball.
I don't know. Curveball, maybe a curveball.
Okay, suppose you can have a reverse sinker. I don't know if that exists, where you could throw and it goes low. So this is so long if it manages to dip within 3 tfachim towards the ground.
No, I think with gravity, it's not going to go back up again.
Unless there's a kind of spin on the ball that.
You put the little motors that the bike guys put inside the ball.
So let's read the Rambam. We might be surprised. I'm doing this, if it ends up in the airspace of 3 tvachim, let's read these words carefully. V'nach al gabi mashu, and it ends up landing on or passing on top of something. Afal pi shenekar inisgago v'yotza hachefetz m'rishus hayachid l'rishus hayachid acheres. I'm sorry. Pause that. V'hu sheyavar l'malam mishleisha tvachim. Even amar pachas mishleisha. V'nach al gabi mashu. If it ends up rolling, touching the ground, or being within 3 tvachim, and even though it ends up in another private domain, although it may have passed on to another private domain, we look at it as if it landed in the public domain. The Rambam's words disturb me because I wonder if the Rambam is learning. It shouldn't disturb me, but it disturbs me. I'm wondering if the Rambam has a different interpretation of our Gemara than we presented. So before we go on, let's look. No. Hold on, bear with me a moment. This is the Rambam. He got bounced. Here we go. Okay. So again, the Rambam seems to be passing like the Chachamim according to the third interpretation. Within 3 tvachim, you're chayiv, but above 3 tvachim, he would take the most lenient position. Again, is the Rambam saying that you should do it? No, the Rambam is saying you're potter from the biblical act of Chilul Shabbos, the biblical malacha. So here, the Maggid Mishnah quotes our Gemara. Okay, here's the good news, folks. If we're going to keep on learning through our Gemara, we'll have more information that will make everything make a whole lot more sense. Yeah. So let's hold out. We have a question. Why does the Rambam phrase the Gemara the way he did? And now we're going to have an opportunity to look out for future clues on that matter. But there we have the Rambam on the subject, seeming to paskin based on our Gemara, according to the Chachamim, according to the third interpretation. But we are not yet done fully parsing and analyzing all of the facets of the discussion of throwing from one domain to another. Folks, I should point out, we are now 97b. Although when we opened, I said we're 97b, we're actually 97a. Now we're 97b. And no, not yet. We're almost there. Here we go. We are going to now pass from 97A to 97B. Taner Rabbanan. So until now, we're talking about throwing from a private domain, getting the item to end up in another private domain, passing through a public domain. What if the situation is reversed? What if Mirshus Harabim, you're throwing from a private public domain to a public domain. Rishus hayachid be'emtza, but in the middle you have a Rishus hayachid. So is this good news or bad news? Let me ask you a question. If you were just throwing in a public domain, are you allowed to do that? Is that not considered a malacha?
No, you still can't go for Amos in a Rishus.
So you can't throw for, you can't cause something to move for Amos. You also can't cause it to go within a private domain. So we have the Gemara is going to do a little bit of an analysis. What are we talking about? What are the circumstances? Are we saying, according to Chachamim, are you entirely potter? Or are you only exempt from double jeopardy? So all I want to bring to your attention is that at a superficial reading, sounds confusing. Rishus Harabim, you're throwing from Ocean Drive to South Ocean Drive, but in the middle there's a little store or a closed off place, enclosure, a doggy park, I don't know. Or Rishus Hayachid B'Emsa, and there's in the middle, there's a Rishus Hayachid. Folks, is there any such arrangement on Ocean Drive? Do we have anywhere that there would be what's ostensibly a public domain and a private domain in the middle? We'll have to be creative to try to imagine such a scenario. I'm thinking maybe you try.
Maybe on the beach where the guy has his little restaurant in the middle of the beach.
Maybe I'm thinking, the beach club has that doggy park on the side when you're going up to the.
Yeah, exactly. And the guy
so
sells
maybe.
there.
Yeah. So maybe. But anyways, Rebbe says one is chayiv. I'm sorry. Rebbe mechayiv v'chachamim poitrim. Rebbe says one is liable for doing so, and the chachamim say one is potter. Does that make sense that the chachamim should make one potter? Ultimately, you cause an item to travel travel in the public domain for Amos or from a public domain to a private domain. What is going on? Should you be potter?
I have it.
All right, so let's take a look. Rav and Shmuel in the discussion of this statement say like this. Let's read this carefully. Although here it sounds like Rebbe Mechayiv, Rebbe says you're Chayiv. Rav and Shmuel both explain it's not so simple. We're talking about and I think we had this actually quoted in the Gemara earlier. We are only talking about a private domain that has a roof on it. As you know, although we typically imagine public domain being the public property and Rishus HaYachid private property, it's entirely not simple. Hypothetically, you could have a privately owned property that has the law of a public domain, and you could also have an area that is pretty, just a fence around it, just an enclosure with no roof, and that's considered halachically a Rishus HaYachid. Rav and Shmuel said when Rebbe says here, Mechayev, you're Chayev, we're talking about that there is a roof. Why? And what do we mean? The Amrinon Besa, if it's a house, if it's a structure, Kiman Demal Yadami. We imagine that the whole house is full of stuff. And therefore, Rashi, Mitokshu Choshech Umalei Havla. This Rashi warrants a lot of analysis, but suffice it to say, in the eyes of the law, in the eyes of the Gemara, according to Rabbi Shmuel, if something passes through an enclosed structure, we don't know what's going on in there. So we consider as if it has landed, even if it actually has not landed. We consider as if the house is full of a mound of stuff, and when it passes through, it's rested.
Rabbi, you have so many examples. I mean, the guys on the beach that keep the chairs in an enclosure with a roof. Right.
Yeah. That's actually not a bad idea. If we'll designate the beach as a public domain, it's a very busy space. People are always going there. That's an interesting example. So we're saying is
it's also locked.
And it's locked. So a roofed structure, which is more of a enclosed structure, not just a little fenced off area. Rebbe says chayiv. But if there's no roof, kigon, Rashi says chatzer, a courtyard, a fenced-in little doggy park. You're not chayiv. Hold on. Are we trying to say that you're allowed to throw football, baseball, basketball, whichever one it is, rugby? You're allowed to throw. I didn't say a soccer, but then I said football. If you get a ball to go pass from a public domain through a private domain back in the public domain, you're exempt. This is acceptable. This is not a malacha. How could that be? So the Gemara is going to explain a little more. Omar, Rav Chana, Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel. So Rav Chana quotes Rav Yehuda, the name of Shmuel. Mechayiv hoya Rebbe shtayim. What does it mean, mechayiv? It means you've done two malachas. Achas mishum hotza. One malacha is the act of hotza, having something leave. Okay, I think we're saying the second. What you've done essentially is cause something to go from a public domain into a private domain. That would be considered hachnasa. And then you've also caused it to leave a private domain and go back into the public domain. And so Rebbe, although it's a single throw, and maybe the ball never stopped moving, conceptually, Rebbe, when he says mechayev, what he means to say is you're actually in trouble twice, two times. You've done two different malachas. A single fluid motion, a single throw, two malachas. Makes sense, folks? Well, it makes more sense than Chachamim saying you're entirely potter. So that is the additional explanation that comes from Shmuel. And so I imagine we'd be compelled to say that the Chachamim also are mechayev. The Chachamim also say that you've done something, you're chayev, but only one time. So now let's think of the two. So we have a very innocent sounding teaching, public domain to public domain via private domain, chayiv and pater, and we have already two details. We have Rav and Shmuel agreeing that there has to be a roof, and we have Shmuel explaining that when mechayiv, it means you're in trouble twice. Yosef, Rav Chana, v'kakashalei. Rav Chana was saying and had a problem. He had a question. Rav Chana had a problem with the teaching that he conveyed right over here about Stein being liable twice. What was his problem? We just turned the page. The Memra, Chayiv Rebbe, I told him, if Rebbe says that you are Chayiv twice, once for causing something to go from public to private domain, once from causing something to go from a private to public domain, in the language of the Gemara, once for doing Haitzah, once for doing Haknasa, then what's wrong? What's wrong? That can't be. Because does Rebbe believe that when you do an Av and a Tulda, you do two acts, one that is a primary Malacha, and one is a subcategory, you would have to be Chayiv twice? In truth, we know that one is usually only Chayiv one consequence, one carbon, if they did an Av and a Tulda in the same fell swoop. But here it sounds like if Rebbe Mechayiv Shtayim, if Rebbe says you're liable twice, it means that you did the primary malacha, which is Haitzah, moving something from a private to public domain. You did a secondary malacha, Hachnasa, moving something from the public to the private domain. Does that make sense? Is that consistent with what we know about Rebbe's teachings? In Rabbi Steinsaltz's words, after all, carrying out and carrying in constitute a primary category and its subcategory. V'hatanya, we know that Rebbe teaches, Rebbe Omer, Dvarim, Hadvarim, Eladvarim. This may be familiar. Basically, the Torah uses some additional letters and words to teach us, to teach us that there are 39 Av Malacha, primary Malachas, and all the other acts of Malacha are subcategories associated with these 39, and it teaches us that one would only have a single consequence for doing an Av and a Tulda. And based on this, Rav Chana, who is conveying the teaching about Rebbe, has a problem because Rebbe would now be self-contradictory. So the Gemara is going to give an answer. Amar Le Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef responds, Mar Ahamas Nila Bekashale de Rebbe ad Rebbe. Rav Yosef tells Rav Chana, their teacher Rav Yehuda, because right, Rav Chana here. I'm sorry, folks, if you're a little confused. It is a little confusing. Here, Rav Chana quotes Rav Yehuda teaching us about Shmuel. So Rav Yehuda is the teacher of Rav Yosef and Rav Chana. And so Rav Yosef tells him, Mar Aham Asnila. Rav Yehuda taught the teaching in the name of Shmuel that you're Chayev Shtayim. The Kashalei the Rebbe ad Rebbe. So it sounds like we have an issue where Rebbe seems to be contradicting himself. But in truth, Anan ad Rabbi Yehuda Masnisan v'le Kashalan. Let's read Rabbi Steinsaltz here. According to Rabbi Yehuda, one teaching of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi is a contradiction to the other. However, we learn the statement of Rabbi Yehuda about Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda, according to us, was not actually talking about Rabbi. He was talking about another opinion. And if the opinion about being chayiv twice was actually not from Rebbe, so then you don't have a contradiction. In other words, we've been compelled to answer that there was a mistake in the tradition, and we're actually quoting the teaching not of Rebbe, but of Rabbi Yehuda. If you say that, we have a problem with the text, but we've extricated ourselves from having a contradiction between Rabbi Yehuda himself. Well, how do we say this? Tanya, Rishus Hayachid, bear with me, folks. Rishus Hayachid, Rishus Hayach Arabim, Avar Amis, Rishus Arabim, Rabbi Yehuda Machayev, Chachamim Poitrim. We have a debate where when something moves from a Rishus Hayachid to a Rishus Arabim, but it passed 4 Amis in the public domain, Rabbi Yehuda says Chayev Chachamim Poitrim. Rabbi Yehuda Shmuel Machayev Rabbi Yehuda Shtayim. Shmuel taught that this Rabbi Yehuda says Chayev, it means Shtayim. So basically, we had an apparent contradiction. We know that Rabbi says that in Avan and Malacha you're not Chayev twice, you're only Chayev once. We thought that Rabbi taught us here Mechayev Shtayim, you're liable twice. And so Rabbi Yosef explains that in truth that was not the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. Nasi, it was the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. And Rabbi Yehuda had a different viewpoint about double jeopardy. Usually we say there is no double jeopardy, there's no double consequence for an Av and a Tolda. But Rabbi Yehuda apparently has a different viewpoint. Rabbi Yehuda is comfortable with a person having, being chai for an Av and a Tolda. That's the crux of what's been said over here. Rabbi Yehuda Mashmuel Mechai Rabbi Yehuda Shtayim Achas Mishmoi Tzava Achas Mishmavara. If when he says chayiv, he means only once. This is a rehash of what I shared with you earlier. Then the rabbis are saying you're entirely exempt. And they would never say that you're exempt from moving an item from a private to public domain. I'm debating if we should stop here. Folks, should we stop here or should we trudge through this?
Rabbi, is this being recorded?
It is being recorded, yes.
I don't see the record button on
It's
It's
being
on.
recorded. It's on. It's being recorded.
Yeah.
If you want to say something unrecorded, I can stop the recording, but or pause it actually.
It's on.
It's on. So yeah, bear with me another second. Let's just get to the end. I know this is a little bit confusing, but in a moment it'll be less confusing. Rabbi Yehuda, there's a teaching that says you cause something to go from a private domain to a public domain. Rabbi Yehuda says you're chayiv, chacham say you're pater. We cannot conceive of a scenario where you cause an item to move 4 amis in a public domain, and you should be entirely pater. Therefore, Shmuel wants to say that the word chayiv means you're in trouble twice. The word pater means you're in trouble once, which, by the way, was the same explanation we gave a long time ago when we said you throw something from a public domain to a private domain, to a public domain via private domain. Rebbe Mechayev and Chachamim Poitrim, we said the same thing. It's not possible that you should be chayiv, you should be entirely pater. Here we're saying that you've got to be chayiv twice, and that's what Rabbi Yehuda believes. Rabbi Yehuda believes there is such a thing as double jeopardy. Where it says no, maybe Rabbi Yehuda actually says you're only chayiv once. And the rabbis indeed do say you're entirely pater. How could you be pater if something passes through a public domain? Maybe when he was carrying it, he placed it down first. Or he said, he wants it to stop and not travel 4 amis in the public domain. So his intention is to not have it be carried, for amis in the public domain. And so therefore, all he did is a single malacha. Rashi. Basically, if his intention was that it should rest before moving into the next domain, he'll only be chayiv once. He'll be chayiv for carrying, but he wouldn't be chayiv for the 4 amis because his intention was that it shouldn't travel 4 amis.
Rabbi, so if somebody would carry 2 amos, put it down, wait a while, and then go another 2 amos, has he carried 4 amos?
Biblically, no. Midoraisa, I'm gonna have to stop here. This is a good Gemara, but it's very involved, and I want to start tomorrow. We'll give a recap, and then we'll finish it off tomorrow. Biblically, midoraita, if a person is in the public domain and they keep on stopping less than every 4 amas, they may manage to escape the technical melacha of carrying. This doesn't mean that
People
one
do-
should do so, but technically one may avoid the consequence of the
People
melacha.
do it sometimes when they carry a
Shalom aleichem.
child.
So it's
People-
in halacha, there are rare examples where beles breira, when a person's, and again, I don't want to go into the specifics now because we're running against the clock, but there are certain rare situations where one may actually employ this heter to escape
On this building.
sorry, to escape it. All right, let's stop here, dear friends. So we stop smack in the middle. Tomorrow with Hashem's help, we'll recap again, and then we'll move forward. We only have probably I'd say within the first 10 minutes we'll finish this discussion, and that's the story. So as it stands,
Medical, it could be anything.
so let's leave it at that. Dear friends, shkoyach for joining us today. So when I said yesterday would be a Gemara, today is a real Gemara. Join us tomorrow for a recap, and we'll continue our journey through Shas. Again, Baruch Hashem, we're Shabbos Sadik Zayin Amud Beis, a fantastic place to be. Yeah, shkoyach to all. Tomorrow is what? Tomorrow is Wednesday. Thursday, we're gonna have an alternate link, so just put that in your mind now. All right, shkoyach, everyone, have a wonderful day.
I have to go to the left.
Isn't.
Good night.
Right.